let's discuss gradient boosting trees. But before we dive into this model, before we start talking about this model, let's recap random forest so we can better contrast gradient boosting trees with random forest. In a random forest, the training process was independent of all the trees. In other words, training one tree isn't going to affect the training process of another tree. Essentially what we did is we gave each tree a different data set through bootstrapping, said, okay, go at it, go ahead and train this other tree. Here's another data set that I derived via bootstrapping. Here you go through the training process. All these training were done independently from each other. There's no influence. You can visualize that as we can just have, this is our forest here, the boundary of our forest, and here are our estimators that are all trained independent of each other with no interaction. And since we applied bootstrapping to generate these different data sets, and since we aggregated all the results to report one value, this type of ensemble model is going to refer to bagging, bootstrap plus aggregation. You can view that we arrange our trees in parallel. So maybe, since we're talking about parallel, maybe a different way we can arrange our trees is if we were to arrange them in series. In other words, we can have one tree, we can train this tree, and depending on how that tree is trained, it's going to affect how the next tree is trained. We train the second tree, and through that training process, that's going to affect the training of the immediate downstream model. So we can start chaining our trees this way, in series, as opposed to arranging them independently of each other in a parallel fashion. So let's discuss a different way we can create an ensemble model using trees, using decision trees. This is how we're going to go ahead and work with the gradient boosting tree model. We don't have trees in parallel, we're going to have trees in series. When we're discussing the concept of gradient boosting trees, we have the idea of a weak learner. A weak learner is just a model that does pretty poorly. It's a rather weak learner. It's unable to learn too much from the data set. So it's going to perform very poorly. In terms of trees, you can imagine a weak learner would be a tree that's a stump, maybe 1 or 2 depth, a very short depth. In the concept of boosting, every time you hear the concept of boosting with regards to ensemble models, that just means the process of gathering up weak learners and configuring them such that we can generate a strong learner. So it's just a way we can configure these weak learners to derive a strong learner. We're going to boost the weak learner's performance. That's why we get the name boosting ensemble models. So let's discuss the construction of our gradient boosting trees. So the way we go about this, let's just go ahead and take the realm of regression for this example. And what is typically done is that we're going to start off with a very simple tree, a very simple model. So we're going to say f of naught of x is equal to h of naught. So h's are going to refer to our weak learners. In this case, the first model we're going to use is just a model that predicts the mean value of our labels. So this naive model we discussed before, this baseline model, is a very simple model, just predict the mean labels. That's how we're going to initialize our gradient boosting trees in the realm of regression. For classification, what do you think would be a good suggestion to initialize the model? What's a good weak learner to use if we're working on classification? Well, one way you can go ahead and do is just have a model that predicts the majority class. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we want to construct a better model of the following form. We have our original model plus a new model. So this is an additive model. So h of 1 represents the new model we're going to add, a new tree we're going to add in this process. And gamma 1 represents the scaling. How much will this new model is going to contribute to the value we're trying to predict? So the question is, how do we go about picking gamma, and how do we go about training this new model? Well, this new model, the first thing we're going to do when we grow this process, is we're going to train this h of 1 model on what are called the pseudo-residuals of our model. So this is the equation for the pseudo-residuals. And notice the pseudo-residuals are going to be the derivative of a loss function with respect to our model. And don't forget we have a negative sign there, but it's going to be proportional to the derivative of our loss function with respect to our model. So we also need to pick a loss function. And since we're in the realm of regression, we can use the square loss function. In other words, we can say, okay, our loss, the measurement of our loss from the true label values represented here, with the model, is going to be simply the deviation, so the error, squared. And of course, we can sum them all up for all our observations. So those are our square loss. So very similar to the sum of squares error. Of course, our loss function is arbitrary. I could have used a different one, but just for illustrative purposes, we're going to assume a square loss at the moment. So we're going to train h of 1 on the derivative of our loss function with respect to the model. So let's actually compute this derivative. Let's compute this derivative of this loss function to see what are these pseudo-residuals. That's a weird name, pseudo-residuals. So we can take the derivative of this, take the derivative of our loss function with respect to f of naught, and what we discover so we have to apply the chain rule to take the derivative. So we have -2 summation of y, the true value, and f. So you don't need a summation sign because we're going to calculate the residual, the pseudo-residuals for each observation. So it's -2 times this residual, this deviation. Yeah, so this right here is our pseudo-residuals. So notice what these pseudo-residuals resemble. What is it proportional to? We see here the pseudo-residuals, if we have a square loss error, are simply the residuals, or are proportional to the residuals. A residual just represents the deviation from the true value with what the model predicts. So f of here, I can more specific, f of naught, represents our predictive value, the value that we're going to get from the model, and we're going to calculate the deviation from the true value. So by definition, this term right here that I'm going to circle is a residual. So it just so happens, if we were to use a square loss function, a square loss error, then these quote pseudo-residuals that we define are simply going to be proportional to what we consider the residuals. So we're going to train h of 1 on these pseudo-residuals. So basically we're going to train h of 1 on the error, which makes sense because you can think of h of naught as tries its best to model the process. Whatever error, whatever h of naught was unable to model, what it got incorrect, the new model will try to pick up that slack. Try to go ahead and model the residuals. So it's going to be trained on the residuals. It's going to be trained on what needs to be corrective. And then we simply add its contribution to the overall model. So you can view this as sort of a chain. Whatever H and naught was unable to capture, the next model will try to do its best. Okay, so once we've trained H of 1, let's discuss how we go about calculating this gamma 1 value. So remember I said before, gamma is going to represent the contribution of that model to the overall model. How much should it contribute? And the way we go about calculating gamma 1 is we're going to look for gamma 1, in this case, that's going to minimize our loss function. Whatever loss function we chose. So in this case, we know what f of naught is. We don't know what gamma 1 is. We know what h of 1 of x is, since we just trained it. So we can just simply choose, figure out, solve this problem of figuring out what is the best contribution for this model to have the overall drop, the greatest drop in our loss metric. And then once we figured out what h of 1 is, then our updated model, I'll write it down here, our updated model is going to be, f of 1 is going to be h of naught plus gamma 1 times h of 1 of x. Then we repeat the whole process once more. Repeat the whole process. We're going to train a new model, in this case h of 2. So h of 2 is going to be trained on the pseudo residuals. In this case, the pseudo residuals are going to be the residuals from our previous model, f of 1. So whatever that model was unable to model, what it got incorrect, guess what? H of 2 is going to try to pick up the slack. It's going to be trained on the errors, such that when we add its contribution to the overall model, we can get better predictions. We can correct our errors from the previous model. So these new models are trying to fix any of the previous errors from the upstream models in this chain. And so now we have a series of trees. And of course, repeat until we've satisfied or we've met our criteria of how many trees we want in our series.